Okay, today we are learning about percent proportions. There are many ways to be able to find the answers to percent problems, but we are going to focus on the percent proportion today only because we just finished with proportions and just took a quiz on that. So I will take the notes. I will actually complete the notes on this piece of paper. Your option for this would be to print out a blank copy of the notes, or it would be to upload a copy of the notes to your Chromebooks using this app called Kami. If you've used it before, you would be able to do that. Or you could just write this down on a separate sheet of paper, on a blank piece of paper. You really don't need a printed version of these notes. So whatever works best for you, and you may not know what works best for you right now, and that's fine. But I would definitely recommend that at some point you do actually practice these problems on the notes, because you do learn by doing, not just by watching. So do the best that you can. I know we don't have the ability to have a conversation right now while I fill these notes out, and that's okay. You could probably post just questions in the discussion if you'd like. So I already started writing a little bit here, but let's get started. So we are going to solve these types of problems all using a percent proportion. And in a percent proportion, one ratio compares a part of a quantity to the whole quantity. The other ratio shows the equivalent percent written as a fraction over 100. And typically, we're really used to already dividing our percents by 100 because that's how we turn them into decimals. So we've been doing that for a while. And remember, these notes are really a review of something you may have learned in junior high. And we're doing this review unit just to gear up for practice SATs and SATs, because a huge portion of the SAT is on percents and proportions, a really huge portion. So we just want to make sure we review this, and then moving forward we'll be dealing with percents when we do our geometry unit. So depending on the wording of the problem, there's two formulas that might help you. One is using numbers that are around these two words, is and of. Or you might use a fraction, depending, especially if it's a word problem, this might not be so obvious. Instead, using part or over a whole. So the most basic example I could give you is if you're talking about people at a pizza party and you want to know what percent of the pizza was eaten, this would probably make more sense to use because they're not going to use these words in a problem about pizza. But we're going to start really basic here. Option number 3 is to translate, but we're actually going to do that on our next notes. We're going to just focus on, I'm going to cross this out, we're going to actually focus on solving percent problems strictly with proportions today. And some of you might have your own way of doing this already. Remember, for all of us, this is review. I'd keep an open mind to all the ways that we could do these problems, because you may have only learned one way or remembered learning one way, and you might find another method really useful. So in this lesson specifically, I do want you to practice with finding the answers to these percent problems using proportions. So let's start with number 1. 18 is what percent of 40? So I think the most obvious formula would be this one right here. And this is using words like is and of to tell you where to put the numbers in the fractions. So I see 18 is, and then I see of 40. So I'm going to make a fraction or a ratio using 18 and 40. So the number that is next to is, which is 18, will be in the numerator, and then the number next to of, which is 40, will be in the denominator. So 18 over 40 equals percent over 100. Now in a proportion you're solving them, so you don't actually know every number in the proportion. So we don't know the percent, so we're going to put an X over 100. So we were able to fill out this proportion right here. And we are going to cross multiply. So 40 times X is 40X. Equals 18 times 100, which is 1800. So here's our equation. And if I divide both sides by 40, In your calculator, 1800 divided by 40 is going to give you x equals 45. There's your final answer. So actually, 18 is 45% of 40. Okay. Sometimes the word what typically means that you don't know what that value is, and you'd replace those with an x. So the words of and is and percent are always going to be in a different spot. If you notice, this looks a little different than that problem right here. So what percent of 75 is 80? Well, the number next to of is 75, and the number next to is 80. So we're going to make a proportion. The number next to is 80. The number next to of is 75. And then we have to set it equal to percent over 100, which we don't know. It says what percent. I don't know what percent. So I also have to put 100 or an x there over 100. And we're going to cross multiply again. 75 times x is 75x. 80 times 100 is 8,000. I know that because 8 times 1 is 8. And then I have 1 0 here and 2 zeros here. So that's total 3 zeros. And if I divide both sides by 75, I will get x equals 106.6 repeating. Now, it doesn't actually tell us to round or how to round because the problem really isn't an application problem. So it doesn't really matter how we round. I think that rounding to the nearest tenth is actually the best case scenario for us to all agree on. Let's just round to the nearest tenth. I would never round to the nearest whole number because then I think you're rounding too much. Okay. Now let's do a problem where we're not looking for the percent, but it's something else. So I see the word is, so what is, and I see of 15, so let's fill out the proportion. It's always over 100, I do know that. So what is, I don't know what is, so I'm going to have an x there, over 15, because that's next to the of, and then 30%, I know that this is our percent, because there's a percent symbol there, so 30 over 100. And I am going to cross multiply. X times 100 is 100x. 30 times 15 is 450. And I've already completed these notes on my own just so that it could be a little easier to do the notes for you guys without having to stop and use my calculator. While you're doing these notes, I really recommend that you try actually using your calculator. So 30 times 15, I didn't do that in my head. I actually used my calculator. I want you to do the same. So 30 times 15 is 450. I'm going to divide by 100 on both sides. And my answer is 4.5. Okay. Let's move on. I'm going to do number 4. Find 8.5% of 160. If you notice, the word is isn't in here. You could always rewrite it, like we need to find what is 8.5% of 160, but I also know that there's process of elimination. For example, so equals, I'll set my two fraction bars equal to each other. I know 8.5% is a percent, so I know I could put that over 100, and I know that the number next to of is 160, so it only makes the most sense that the x is where the is goes. So if I cross multiply, x times 100 is 100x. 160 times 8.5 is 1360. And if I divide by 100 on both sides, I get x equals 13.6. Also, feel free to pause this video to do the problem on your own. You could always do that. Or you could just do the notes on your own if you feel really strong in percents, and then you can go ahead and compare what you have to what I have, and then watch the video if you need. Okay, number 5. 28 is 4% of one number. So 28 is 4%, so 28 of what number? So there's no number next to of, there's my x. 4 is the percent, so that's what's going over 100. 4 times x is 4x. 28 times 100, well, 28 times 1 is 28 with 2 more zeros, 2800. And if I divide both of those by 4, 2800 divided by 4 is x equals 700. Okay, number 6. 86%, okay, so two fractions equal to each other. I know 86 is over 100 because there's my percent. Of what number means that there's an x here. Is 77.4, so is in the numerator, and I'm going to cross multiply. Especially when I have a decimal, if I'm multiplying by 100, that means the decimal is moved over 2 spaces. So 77, here's where the decimal would go. It's going to actually wrap around the 4 and around an invisible 0. So 7,740 equals 86 times x. And if I divide by 86 on both sides, I get x equals 90. Okay, number 7. Let's move this a little bit. Find 28.5% of 200. So two fraction bars equal to each other. There's our proportion. 28.5 over 100 because that was our percent. The number next to of is 200. And there's no is word, so the only thing that's left is to put an x here. You can also rewrite this as what is 28.5% of 200. So if I cross multiply, 100x equals 5,700. If I divide by 100 on both sides, it's kind of, when you're dividing, you're moving the decimal place to the left. So the decimal is actually right here. If I move it 2 spaces to the left, since I'm dividing, the number is getting smaller. So it makes sense that I want to move the decimal 2 spaces to the left. I get x equals 57. Number 8, 52 is what percent of 125? I actually see this what percent here, which means I don't know the percent. So when I make my fraction bars, I'm going to make the percent on x over 100. 52 is, so 52 here, of 125, so that goes here. And if I cross multiply, 125x equals, I'm multiplying by 100, so I'm moving this invisible decimal point, I'll put it right there, 2 spaces to the right, which means that I'm going to get 52 times 100, it's going to be 5,200. And I will divide 125 on both sides, and I will get x equals 41.6. Okay, 7.5% of what number is 21? Of what? That means that there's an x going where their of is 21, so 21 up here. 7.5 has the percent symbol, so that's what's going over 100. Going to cross multiply, 7.5 times x is 7.5x. 21 times 100 is 21 times 1 is 21, 2 zeros, 2100. Divide by 7.5, and x equals 280. What is 64% of 80? What is, so x over of 80, so 80, remember I'm using is over of, equals 64% is 64 over 100. If I cross multiply, 100 times x equals 64 times 80, which is 5120. And if I divide by 100 on both sides, I get x equals 51.2. Okay. Actually, I'd like to put the date on here. 2020. I wish it was 2021. It would mean this would all be over. Okay. What percent is 0.5 of 3? So, remember that is over of equals percent over 100. What percent? So what percent, I don't know what the percent is, x over 100, is 0.5, so 0.5 of 3, down here. So if I multiply, 3 times x is 3x, half of 100 is the same as saying 0.5 times 100. Half of 100 is 50. I'm going to divide by 3. I'm already going to realize that this is going to give me a decimal. I would give your answer as a decimal to the nearest tenth, like we said, or delta math, because that's where your homework is going to be on some of the time. You could keep it in reduced fraction form, or 50 over 3 is fine. Okay, number 12. 103.2 is 40% of what number? So is 103.2 over, I don't know, of what, equals 48%, so 48 over 100. 48 times x is 48x. Multiplying something by 100 means I just have to move the decimal 2 spaces to the right, because we're trying to make the number bigger if we're multiplying by 100. So the decimal's right here. If I move it over 1 space, and then a second space would be an invisible 0. So I have 10320, 10,320. If I divide by 48, I get x equals 215. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. We're going to do applications on our next lesson. I will upload the assignment for these notes, for the percent proportion notes on Google Classroom. Okay, so here are the notes. They will be uploaded, and then I will let you know what the assignment is. It's probably going to be a Delta Math and a worksheet over the next couple days. And then we will move on to application problems. So I will hear from all of you. I will actually communicate to all of you really soon. If you have questions on the lesson, please feel free to comment in the Google Classroom post, and I'll be happy to answer some questions. I'm thinking of doing maybe a question and answer session if we could, or maybe answering some of your questions on video. So have a great day.